Welcome to the Fun and Wellness channel, and it's also the first travel video that I made for our Fun and Wellness channel. So I went to Israel in September of 2022 with my sister and her husband. We went through a travel agency that had planned the trip. I started the video just before the current conflict in Israel, and I know that no one's going to be going to Israel right now. I'm hoping and praying that peace will come to that area so that you can go to see some of the things that I treasured. Happy adventuring along with Jane. We flew to Tel Aviv first. I've included a picture from my hotel window at night with the full moon overlooking the Mediterranean. I thought the view was spectacular. Up in the left-hand corner is Jaffa. That is an old town that is close to Tel Aviv, and you could actually walk there along the Mediterranean. We also went to dinner right on the beach there, and we're lucky there was a place open. We looked around quite a bit to find a place open because it was the Sabbath. It was Saturday, so that was their Sabbath, and not many cars were on the road. Also, if you were strictly religious Jewish, you couldn't operate mechanical things because they considered it work, and you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. It runs from Friday night when the sun goes down to Saturday evening when you can see 3 stars in the sky. Now, the next picture is my sister and brother-in-law in front of our nice hotel. And that was right across the street from where we ate. We managed to find an open restaurant because it was a Sabbath and there wasn't much open. We shared a wonderful fish dinner. There was crab and shrimp and mussels and all kinds of wonderful seafood that we ate. Food was really, really good. Now, if you look at the hotel, it did have quite a few floors. So what they had in each hotel, because we stayed in hotels 1 week later, too, on the Sabbath, was they would have one elevator that went all the way up to the top floor and then came and stopped at every single floor down the way so that no one would have to push a button and do work. I accidentally got on an elevator like that because the bus was leaving, and I realized that it was going to take too long, so I quickly got off and went down the stairs. Fortunately, I was only on the 5th floor or whatever, so it didn't take too long. We toured some of the parts of Tel Aviv on foot. I have a few pictures here. One is a white Bauhaus building. That was a style of architecture. Actually, Tel Aviv has one of the largest collections of Bauhaus architecture in the world. Also, this is a picture of the Tel Aviv Foundation Monument commemorating the foundation of Tel Aviv in 1909, where a group of original families divvied up the area, which was just beach and mud, and established the city of Tel Aviv. And then we have a street view. You can see some bicycles, so the office buildings. And then this picture is of a restaurant in Tel Aviv. Apparently it's a Japanese restaurant, but it was one of the old buildings that was refurbished for a restaurant. So the next thing we did was we toured Jaffa, which is what I showed you was down road in that curve. Jaffa was mostly beige and stone brick. It was a much older area than Tel Aviv, and it had steps going up and down the old section of town. So here we have some pictures of a square in Jaffa with the buildings all beige, and you can see it's tropical because that's the Mediterranean right next door there. And here was one of the buildings. It's an artist's studio. You can see the artwork on the top floor. And it was also an entrance into some of the covered walkways where a lot of the artists had their shop. So this picture is of a covered walkway in Jaffa where we were going to go into the tour guide's friend's studio, but it was closed that day. He was showing us where it was. It was cool in there because it was covered walkways to a lot of the shops. And so now we come to park in Jaffa that's overlooking the opposite view of my moonlight picture, overlooking the Mediterranean, the beachfront area, and Tel Aviv in the background. And there was a nice couple sitting on a bench right by the beach area, and I asked them if I could take their picture, and they said yes. I just felt like Tel Aviv was a very young town. They had lots of young, lovely people enjoying the beach area, and this just represented to me like the inhabitants of Tel Aviv. We have a movie of just overlooking the same area where you see the beach and the people playing on the beach. So the next day we took a bus toward the north. Israel runs north and south along the Mediterranean. And we stopped at a town called Caesarea. As you can see, there's blocks in the water where the Romans built up the port. There was not any natural ports on this end of the Mediterranean, so they built up their own ports by blocks of stone. I was totally amazed at the ingenuity of the Roman architects. It was a town of old Roman ruins that served as a man-made port for the Romans coming to and conquering Israel. There were ruins of Roman baths there, though they had big posts to hold up the floor, and hot water would run under the floor between the posts, keeping the place warm. They also had public toilets out in the open. You sat on the steps, and the water running under your bum would whoosh your waste products away. Here's our tour guide demonstrating the sitting part. They weren't our current bathrooms, however. There's also a stadium in Caesarea and Roman ruins, and they had some museum exhibits of boats and things like that. So it was pretty interesting. We also went to Nazareth to see the spot where the angel Gabriel asked Mary if she would be the mother of Jesus. The tour guide said that Catholics believe it was that spot, where others believe it was someplace close by. Now, the Church of the Annunciation, dedicated to Mary overlooking this spot, was built in 1969 over the ruins of two previous smaller churches. It was designed to look like a lighthouse to symbolize that Jesus, the light, had come to us to guide us. Then we have a picture of the inside of the church next. And one of the very interesting things that I found was that at least 50 countries sent paintings representing their country in honor of the Virgin Mary, and they were all extremely beautiful. I can't show you all of them. I did take a picture of a few of them, but they were just wonderful, and they all said what country they were from. So now we're still in the northern area, and we stayed in a hotel in the town of Tiberias, overlooking the Sea of Galilee. Now, here's a picture of me on the roof of the hotel. That is not a halo of me. That is the moon shining on the Sea of Galilee. Now, one thing about the Sea of Galilee, it's really a lot more like a lake than a sea. I'm not sure what the difference is between a lake and a sea, but this is very long and narrow, and it actually contains all the fresh water that sustains Israel and the countries around it. It starts out as a river close to the Mediterranean, and then it becomes the Sea of Galilee, opens up bigger, and then I believe it turns into a river again, and then it finally ends up further south as the Dead Sea. So the next day, we bussed to where Jesus had the Sermon on the Mount, overlooking the Sea of Galilee, and we stopped at a church of the Beatitudes close to it. The tour guide had my sister read the Beatitudes to us out loud. It's a wonderful prayer. Blessed are the, and then there's 8 different verses. We also went to see the Golan Heights, which Israel captured from Syria in the war of 1967 Syria. So here we are on Mount Bental, which is approximately 3,600 feet high. Further north is a 7,000-foot Mount Hermon, which provides snow melt water for the Jordan River, which runs into the Sea of Galilee. Mount Bentel had bunkers that were surprise blasted in the war. Here's a map that was on the top of the lookout area of Mount Bentel. It shows the Mediterranean and then Israel, and it also shows where Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon are. Egypt is further down the south part of Israel where the Gaza Strip is. So then this view is of Syria and Israel. You can see some of the parts are just kind of barren and the other ones are being farmed. It took about 50 years for some of the farms to be able to grow really good crops on them. You could see banana orchards covered with mesh fabric to keep the birds out, since most of them are exported to Europe. Olives, oranges, grapes, dates, and other crops are also raised there. We even saw some big square bales and some John Deere and Case equipment. Our tour guide was Israeli, so he tended to side with Israel from his point of view. He pointed out the areas that were Syrian. Most of them were just desert-like and brown, whereas the Israelis turned their part of the desert into green areas with crops growing. Syria wants some of it back, but it's complicated because, yes, you want to congratulate the Israelis on making the farmland productive, but they also took it from the Syrians, and so there's always two sides to the story. So here's a picture of the countryside. The next day, we went to Jerusalem. It has an old city with a wall around it and a not much newer, large, sprawling city around that. It is mostly beige. I kept losing the hotel because it looked like all the other ones, and the streets were diagonal. So when you thought you were just going around the corner, you ended up on a totally different street. I did manage to figure it out eventually, but there were some moments of not quite knowing where I was, especially when I was walking anyway. On part of the bus tour, we stopped on a hill overlooking the city of Jerusalem, which was a beautiful view. Now, the main feature of the old city is the Dome of the Rock, which is golden, and it's right in the middle of the picture there. The old city has a wall around it, and they have several different gates that some are restricted by who can actually enter via those gates. And the new city was kind of behind it. So up on the wall where we took the panoramic view of the old city, there's a camel, mostly for pictures for tourists. The old city is divided into 4 sections: Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and Armenian. It has covered streets and old shops. You could easily get lost there. There were a lot of people walking around, and if you dawdled, the group would be gone ahead of you and you had to catch up. Our tour guide had us stop at a place where a man sold pomegranate juice. He had a big squeezer and would put the fruit in the vise and squeeze the juice out into a cup. It was wonderfully good and refreshing because it was so hot there. The covered walks were cooler, but it was still very hot. We went as a group to the Wailing Wall. Nobody was really wailing. It was a big square next to a section of the remaining old west wall of the ancient Jewish temple. They had it divided into a men's and women's section. The women's section was much smaller, and you had to elbow your way in through a bunch of people to put your little paper prayer message into a crack in the wall. The men's section was much larger, and there was plenty of room for them. So the old city consisted of sacred places and then shops and restaurants where you could get food and things to drink, and basically some areas specifically for whatever quarter you were in that you might not be able to go to all of the places. There were only a few hours of one day a week that the Muslims would let non-Muslims in to see the Dome of the Rock. When you look at a picture of Jerusalem, it stands out as the golden dome in the old city. It is revered by most Muslims as the spot from which the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. It is also revered by the Jewish people because that is where the original Temple of Solomon was. You can't go inside the dome, just walk around the square, which is guarded. Because some of us ladies had our ankles showing, They made all the women wear hooded tops made of wool and polyester and matching long skirts covering over your slacks with also hoods covering your hair. Remember, it was close to 100 degrees already. These were not the most comfortable things to wear. I got yelled at by a guard because I lifted my skirts up a bit to not trip going over some stairs because I'm a short person. I was not a happy camper, but I shut my mouth and did what I was told. We were lucky enough to have an Armenian gal in our tour group, and so she got us into the Armenian section of the old town, and they had some incredibly beautiful churches there too, and some nice corner areas that had trees and grass so we could be in the shade and get a drink. So in the old Christian section of the city was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is said to have been built over the location where Jesus was crucified and where the tomb was buried. That church was very, very crowded, and you had to wait in a big, messy line going upstairs to peek at the spot that was the location of the tomb. The church had beautiful chandeliers and ornamentation. One of the things I thought was very positive was that the residents of the old city of Jerusalem had all made truces and allowed each other to go to their holy places and worship there. So even though things were separate and sometimes you couldn't go into the other places, they still got along and were at least tolerant of each other. They did have guards that were walking around and were starting to interrogate some people, so we left. The last day in the desert country, we went to Masada, which is a big flat mountain in the middle of the desert. It was the site of the battle where, instead of giving up, the whole Jewish population that lived there committed suicide rather than be slaves to the Romans. We took a tram up to the top. It was really high up, and they had a model of the mountain we were standing on, but not the whole thing because they had room for animals too behind the building side. I'm here overlooking the desert and the Dead Sea in the distance. The site had been originally built by the Romans with their awesome water engineering expertise. Water came down from the mountains in the spring season to the west of the site, and the Romans channeled it into huge water tanks they hollowed out of the mountain. It gave the occupants fresh water all year round. As a matter of fact, on this model, our tour guide had us pour water from what was like the nearby mountains, and we saw it all run in channels and then disappear into the middle of the mountain. So it was actually fascinating that somebody figured that out, and I thought it was pretty cool. So high school students visit Masada so they would remember the historic battle that between the Israelis living on top of the mountain and the Romans who were trying to take over them. And there's a movie made about it. It's hard to watch because you know how it all ends, but they want to make sure that next generations coming up have an idea of the fiercity of the Jewish people in order to fight for their independence. So then we went to the Dead Sea. It is the lowest place on earth. The Dead Sea is drying up because it's getting hotter and they are taking water out of it for the salts. We floated in the water. We couldn't swim because you couldn't get the salt water in your eyes. So here am I, covered up because it was hot in the sun and I burned, so I had to cover up, but up to my ankles. I did go up further to try to float, but I didn't want to flip over and get my eyes wet either. You can see I have goggles. We had a nice spa in a swank hotel next to the Dead Sea where we cleaned up and had a lovely buffet. Here was a picture of the buffet, just for you to get an idea of how wonderful the food was and all the fresh vegetables. The last day back in Tel Aviv, we got to the airport early, and I wanted to go on the train. My sister and her husband just wanted to stay at the airport and rest. People helped me buy an all-day ticket on the train, which was about $7. I took the train back to Tel Aviv. I wanted to go to the shopping district. I took the train back from Tel Aviv, but I fell asleep. I woke up shortly after the airport stop, and I thought, oh, I will just wait till I get to another stop and get off and get on the train going back to the airport. Unfortunately, it was about an hour. They did finally stop, and I got off the train, and I asked an attendant, where do I go to get back to the airport? And where am I? She said, I was in Jerusalem, which I thought was pretty funny because that's exactly where I started that same day. But I did have plenty of time to get back to the airport. Here is a picture of my sister and her husband at the Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv, going back home, and we made it home safe and sound. A little tired because of the heat, but wiser for the experience. So all in all, it was a wonderful trip, and I would say it is definitely one of the most interesting trips that I have taken. Thank you very much for your time and effort, and subscribe and watch for the next one. All have a wonderful day. Bye.